The Sea is History by Derek Walcott, Summary and Analysis. The Sea is History by Derek Walcott, Summary and Analysis. Introduction. The poem deals with one's history, culture, and life in general. It begins with interrogations that are overly pointed. It is a fact that the process of colonization has been a process of denial. Colonizers have denied everything and anything that remains associated with the colonized. It is also a process of refusing to take notice of culture, history, language and all systems of thought that would probably exist among the colonized. When people are denied their history, culture, and language, it becomes subordination in a manner of hegemony. Thus the colonized are reduced to the status of unevolved people. Thus the life of colonized people becomes oppressive. The poem The Sea is History is heavily packed with biblical images. Line-by-line summary and analysis of The Sea is History by Derek Walcott. Let's see poem lines. Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history. In these lines, the poet asks the Caribbean about the monuments, battles, martyrs, tribal memory. He wants to know where is their history, culture, language which according to him is glorious but undiscovered. He answers himself that the history is hidden in the sea. Here sea represents the storehouse of lost culture, sacrifices, language etc. of the Africans as well as their fears, sorrows, and oppression. Thus sea itself is history. Second stanza. First, there was the heaving oil, heavy as chaos, then, like a light at the end of a tunnel, the lantern of a caravel, and that was Genesis. Then there were the packed cries, the shit, the moaning, Exodus. In these lines, the poet says that for colonialists Caribbeans were heaving oil, heavy as chows, i.e. they were unskilled and useless as crude oil, and thus colonists came up with a light in a ship to make poets' country as they imagined. The ship here refers to the Portuguese ships of the 15th century that were used to explore West Africa and the Atlantic Ocean. It was through these ships that the colonialists arrived in Africa. The poet calls their arrival as Genesis, which is the first book of Christian Old Testament or the Old Bible Torah, because the history of the African natives began when the European colonialists arrived in Africa. However, this light was not light in reality. The real motive of the colonialists was to make the Caribbean their slaves. Exodus, the second book of the Christian Old Testament or the Old Bible Torah, tells the story of the children of Israel leaving the slavery in Egypt, under the guidance of Moses. However, the Exodus is used in quite contrary terms. The Caribbean children were made slaves and taken aboard who were moaning and crying from being beaten and harassed. Third stanza. Bone soldered by coral to bone, mosaics mintled by the benediction of the shark's shadow, that was the Ark of the Covenant. Some of these slaves died on the way. Their bones mixed with the corals of the sea to make mosaics, beautiful pattern, at the bottom covered by the blessings of the shark. Here shark refers to the colonizers who were thirsty for power. This beautiful mosaic, according to the poet, is Ark of the Covenant, i.e. reward for the Caribbeans. Ark of Covenant is a chest that was kept in the Temple of Solomon that was lost after the temple was destroyed. It contained the stone tablets on which the 10 Commandments are written, Moses' rod and a jar of manna, mano salva. According to the poet, the mosaics of the soldiers' bones are Ark of the Covenant for the Africans and thus have great significance. Fourth stanza. Then came from the plucked wire soft sunlight on the sea floor the plangent harp of the Babylonian bondage, as the white cowries clustered like manacles and the drowned women, and those were the ivory bracelets off the Song of Solomon, but the ocean kept turning blank pages looking for history. In these lines, the poet says that sad and mournful songs could be heard from the seabed. These mournful songs have been sung by the Babylonian bondage, i.e. slaves women. Babylonian exile was an event in which the Jews were enslaved in Babylonia, present-day Iraq. The dead bodies of those women who died as slaves and drowned in the sea dead bodies of those women who died as slaves and drowned in the sea are decorated with seashells used as decorative material that look like ivory bracelets, i.e. costly ornaments. Though the story of dead slaves looks like that of Babylonian exile, yet the sea keeps looking for the history, i.e. the African history. 5th stanza. Then came the men with eyes heavy as anchors who sank without tombs, brigands who barbecued cattle, leaving their charred ribs like palm leaves on the shore. Then the foaming, rabid Mawaf, the tidal wave swallowing Port Royal, and that was Jonah. But where is your Renaissance? The colonialists came with eyes heavy as anchors, i.e. greedy will and mercilessness, and started looting, killing and destroying Africans without tombs, i.e. without being noticed. They killed and enjoyed the forest animals. Thus they destroyed the natural ecosystem as the Port Royal, Jamaica, was destroyed by earthquake resulting in its sinking. Jonah is the biblical story of Yunus who was swallowed by giant fish. The poet compares the drowning of Port Royal with Jonah. However, again the poet says that although all these things seem to be similar to African sufferings, yet it is not the real African history, and thus desires to quest for the history. 6th stanza. Sir, it is locked in them sea sand south there past the reef's moiling shelf, where the men o' war floated down. Strap on these goggles, I'll guide you there myself. It's all subtle and submarine, through colonnades of coral, past the Gothic windows of sea Fansta, where the crusty grouper, onyx-eyed, blinks, weighted by its jewels, like a bald queen. The poet answers himself that the history is hidden in the sea sands where the bodies of African slaves reside now. African people must have dedication towards the quest for history, and only then the poet will help them discover it. According to the poet, the bottom of the sea is like a city in which there are drowned bodies of African slaves and fighters. The city has rows of seashells and it has Gothic windows in the form of sea fans. There live a group of fishes with shining eyes, the scales of which look like jewels. Thus the fish, in spite of being bald without a crown, is a queen. Here the word bald queen refers to Queen Elizabeth I, who became half-bald because of some disease. 7th stanza. And these groined caves with barnacles fitted like Zianur cathedrals, and the furnace before the hurricanes, Gomorrah. Bones ground by windmills, Sinto marl and cornmeal, and that was lamentations, that was just lamentations, it was not history. The poet says that this city, having caves divided in symmetry and decorated by barnacles ornaments, is a holy place for the Africans as crutches to colonialists. In the next line, he compares Africa with the city of Gomorrah, a biblical and Quranic place which became the victim of God's wrath and was thus destroyed by fire. The colonialists killed humans whose bodies mixed up with rocks and also ate up the animals as tasty dishes. And thus lamentation and mourning prevailed in Africa. Though African suffering seems to be similar to that of Gomorrah, yet its real history is yet to be discovered. 8th stanza. Then came, like scum on the river's drying lip, the brown reeds of village smiddling and congealing into towns, and at evening, the midges' choirs, and above them, the spire slancing the side of Godas his sun set, and that was the New Testament. In these lines, the poet says that after destroying the natural ecosystem and the houses made up of straw's brown reeds, the colonialists created the towns that looked like the layer of froth on the surface of the river. This was done as per their plan of developing Africa. However, soon the warlike sounds, midges choirs, started raising, and spires of the church that depicted glory, raised so much that they hurt the God and his Son, Christ. The last couplet is also a pun on the death of Christ, who died to save mankind. Thus the good acts in the name of the New Testament were hurting humanity as well as God in reality. Ninth stanza, then came the white sisters clapping to the waves' progress, and that was emancipation jubilation, O jubilation vanishing swiftly as the sea's lace dries in the sun, but that was not history, that was only faith, and then each rock broke into its own nation. Here white sisters represent Christianity. The poet says that Christianity was supposed to bring liberty from paganism, illiteracy, and superstitious rituals. However, this joy was like Emancipation Act of 1863 in America that freed blacks from slavery. However, this liberty and freedom soon vanished away, and the celebration soon vanished away like the sea water dries in the sunlight. The drying of sea lace also depicts the vanishing of purity of African culture. However, again, the poet says that still the African history has not been founded yet, as these movements were related to religion only, and African history, on the other hand, is not based on religion like that of Christians. Africa was a huge country, and colonialists broke it down into small nations just for their own means. 10th stanza, then came the synod of flies, then came the secretarial heron, then came the bullfrog bellowing for a vote, fireflies with bright eyes and bats like jetting ambassadors, and the mantis, like khaki police, and the furred caterpillars of judges examining each case closely, and then in the dark years of Fernand, in the salt chuckle of rocks with their sea pools, there was the sound like a rumor without any echo of history, really beginning. The poet says that first came assembly of clergy buzzing like flies, then came officials like heron, a fish-eating bird, then came the politicians asking for votes like frog, then intellectuals with innovative and new ideas like glowworm, then the ambassadors of other countries like bats, then police like mantis, a predatory insect, then judges like caterpillars. Hence the whole Western system was introduced into Africa. With this, Africans started creating their own political parties to get rid of the Western rule, and this political system marked the beginning of the real history of Africa. The use of insect and animal imagery, flies, heron, caterpillars, etc., is a biblical reference of 10 plagues sent by God to Egypt. The poet is of the view that the Western people